Good morning. It's Friday, March 7th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 518 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Some fireworks in the Israeli media yesterday. Former Israeli police commissioner and former deputy Shin Bet chief Roni Al-Sheikh told state-run Khan Radio that he had learned of illicit connections between Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas funding regime in Doha. This has already been denied up and down by the prime minister and his party, but it's a theme that somehow just won't go away. And one gets a sense that there is some truth to this. But let me just say it clearly. Just because Bibi engaged with Qatar, or even if he gave a green light for Qatar to send money to Gaza in the lead up to 10/7, that doesn't mean he was somehow complicit in the attack on 10/7. It means he may have used some supremely bad judgment. And if the evidence stacks up, this is the kind of thing that could actually force the prime minister to step down. We're going to keep watching that space. In the meantime, reports of Donald Trump doing direct outreach to the Islamic Republic over Iran over a possible nuclear deal. I got to say, I don't like this. We should not be engaging with the Islamic Republic. We should not be engaging with the regime. We should not be legitimizing the regime. Previous attempts to get a nuclear deal done with this regime have proven to be very unhelpful. If anything, it appears to allow the regime to buy time to pursue an illicit nuclear weapon. We're going to watch that as well. Our guest today is Giran Ozcan, executive director of the Kurdish Peace Institute. The Kurds are an ethnic minority located in parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I've personally spent time in Iraqi Kurdistan back in 2004. It was fascinating. The Kurds are a stateless people in a tough neighborhood, and perhaps not surprisingly, given some of their adversaries and enemies, several Kurdish communities have looked to Israel for friendship. For today's program, we're going to take a deeper dive into the Kurdish conundrum and how this unique community fits into the wider matrix of the Middle East. Stay tuned for that conversation in just a few minutes. The Trump administration was in direct discussions with Hamas in recent days, according to several credible reports. No, the two sides were not swapping baba ganoush recipes. The United States was trying to secure the release of additional hostages, including an American. Here's the good news. The U.S. is trying to end this crisis, and we cut out the middleman. We sidestepped the double-dealing Qataris. That feels pretty good to say out loud. But here's the downside. Since the presidency of Richard Nixon, American policy is that we do not negotiate with terrorists. All right, cue up the outrage for Donald Trump. The president has never met a norm he didn't want to shatter. And guess what? He did it again. And word has it the Israelis aren't thrilled. Except here's the thing. Every recent administration has negotiated with terrorists. Biden and Trump negotiated with the Taliban before our disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obama negotiated with the world's most prolific state sponsors of terrorism in Tehran. In other words, negotiating with terrorists is like picking your nose in the car. It might be unseemly, but apparently everyone does it. Here's the other thing. Previously, administrations have gone into these unseemly negotiations aiming to show respect for the enemy, and it has made me cringe. Trump did no such thing here. His recent tweet threatening to unleash on Hamas is precisely what's needed. Diplomacy only works with a credible threat of force. Since that tweet, talks reportedly stalled. No shock there. And the accompanying threat? Well, that may yet release more hostages. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the U.S. Air Force conducted a joint exercise with the Israeli Air Force on Tuesday. The IDF announced the exercise yesterday. Israeli F-35 and F-15 fighter jets took to the skies with an American B-52 bomber. The B-52 flew from the Fairford Royal Air Force Base in the United Kingdom to the Middle East. According to the IDF, the drill was intended to strengthen operational coordination between American and Israeli forces. The IDF said the two militaries are practicing for various threats, but the most obvious threat is Iran. The Israeli Air Force struck Iran twice last year in response to its direct ballistic missile attacks. Neither of those Israeli strikes involved American forces, but that may not be the case if and when the time arrives for military action against Iran's nuclear program. At least that's what the Netanyahu government is hoping for in Israel. Headline 2, clashes broke out in Syria between Assad loyalists and the new government security forces. The violence started in Syria's Latakia province. Latakia was an Assad stronghold before Islamist rebels led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham ousted the dictator in early December. Government forces were reportedly conducting an operation in Latakia when they were ambushed by gunmen loyal to Assad. Clashes erupted and that left at least 16 government security personnel dead. This was one of the bloodiest episodes since the Assad regime fell. Residents in a nearby village reported hearing artillery and machine gun fire and seeing a helicopter firing into the area. Protests then erupted across western Syria. Thousands of people reportedly took to the streets, calling on the government to withdraw its forces. The Syrian government announced a curfew and deployed additional forces to the flashpoints. Something tells me the Turkish-backed al-Qaeda government in Syria is not polling well. Actually, let's be real, they're not polling at all. But you get the point. Headline 3, the Trump administration is getting creatively aggressive with its maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Yesterday, Reuters reported that the administration is weighing a plan to stop and inspect Iranian oil tankers at sea. 6 anonymous sources told Reuters that the plan would involve allied countries stopping ships as they pass through key maritime lanes, including the Straits of Malacca, which lie between Indonesia and Malaysia. This would delay the delivery of crude oil and choke Iranian supply chains, and it could expose some of those dirtbags involved in the illicit sale and transfer of Iranian oil. By the way, that's a technical term in my business, in case you're wondering. Meanwhile, the administration is also considering whether the inspections could happen under the banner of the Proliferation Security Initiative, which dates back to 2003. That initiative was intended to prevent the trafficking of weapons of mass destruction. I'm curious to see how this plays out. And bonus headline 4, Syria's foreign minister made an historic visit to the headquarters of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or the OPCW. The OPCW is the world's chemical weapons watchdog. It's located in The Hague. Syrian Foreign Minister Assad Hassan al-Shibani told the OPCW's Executive Council that Syria's new rulers will destroy the country's remaining chemical weapons. Those are holdovers from the Assad regime. Al-Shibani said that Syria will need the help of the OPCW and the wider international community to make all of that happen. The Assad regime was notorious for using chemical weapons against its own people. Last month, the director of the OPCW visited Syria for the first time since Assad's ouster. The organization is now planning to send a team of experts to Damascus and to visit Assad-era chemical weapon sites. Fingers crossed here, folks. Syria has an opportunity to close a nasty chemical weapons chapter in its history once and for all. All right, it's time for that interview now with Giran Ozcan of the Kurdish Peace Institute. He and I connected recently, and I immediately thought of him as a potential guest for this program. So let's get down to it. Welcome to the Morning Brief, Giran Ozcan.
Thank you very much for having me, John.
All right. Well, let's get down to business here. Let's start with the basics. Who are the Kurds? Where do they live? And what distinguishes them from the Persians, the Turks, and the Arabs?
So the Kurds are a distinct ethnicity that live in what's historically called Mesopotamia, but what now currently falls under the 4 nation states of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. The Kurds, as I said, a distinct ethnicity, are not Persians, they're not Turkish, and they're not Arabs. But about 100 years ago, when these nation states, especially Iraq and Syria and Turkey, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, were formed, almost half the Kurdish population fell within the territorial borders of the new Turkish Republic. Currently, around 3 million Kurds live within what we call Syria. I think there was a recent census that put the Kurdish population in Iraq at around 7 or 8 million. And we know there are upwards of 10 million Kurds in Iran. Altogether, the numbers range. There's no reliable data for this. But the Kurds have said for decades that there are about 40 million Kurdish people that live in the region. And so I think, especially in the last few decades, that number has probably risen. But in each one of these nation states, the Kurds are a significant minority.
It's amazing when people tell me about the numbers and the influence of the Kurds across the region, and we consider the intense focus on the Palestinian cause. We're talking about 5-6 million people versus 40 million people who have gone stateless and have significant control of these other countries. It's amazing that you don't hear the Kurds talked about more often, or at least as often as we hear the Palestinians discussed. The Kurds were crucial in helping the United States fight the war against the Islamic State. But this was highly controversial. So maybe if you would just tell us a little bit about that controversy. Why was this something that was creating an outcry, particularly in the Middle East?
So I think I can start off by giving you an anecdote and something that really happened when ISIS attacked the Yazidis in Sinjar. The Iraqi forces, just like in Mosul and everywhere else, retreated, ran away, left their posts. And when this happened in Sinjar, thousands of women and people were massacred by ISIS in Sinjar. And the city essentially all evacuated up to Mount Sinjar, where 11 PKK fighters, Kurdish PKK fighters, were at the mountain and kept ISIS from approaching the rest of the population of Sinjar and killing even more, massacring even more than what they did. Now, even in the very beginning, I thought this is too cinematic to be true, until I had it confirmed by American officials when they first landed on the airport, when they first landed on the mountain where the Yazidis were holed up. They saw these PKK fighters. Now, since 1998, the PKK has been proscribed as a foreign terrorist organization in this country after extensive Turkish lobbying. So when they were faced with these fighters that had defended these tens of thousands of Yazidis, there was a bit of a conundrum there for them to solve. But at the end of the day, these people needed saving. And then at that time, ISIS was also spreading in northern Syria, where the YPG, which is the ideologically associated organization with the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, who's the leader of the PKK. They were established in Syria, fighting off ISIS in their lands. So a land bridge was created, saving tens of thousands of Yazidis from an even bigger humanitarian crime there. And that's where the relationship started. That's where the US first saw these PKK fighters and PKK affiliated fighters being very effective in the fight against ISIS. And this is, the US tried very hard to train and equip other fighters on the ground, which resulted in a disaster, actually, because a lot of the equipment and the training that was provided ultimately ended up in the hands of ISIS. So that's where the relationship began back in 2013, 2014.
Right. And so we know now that the YPG in particular played a significant role in the defeat of ISIS. And that did not sit well with the Turkish government. So now we've established that the PKK is a recognized terrorist group in the United States. And we know that the PKK or movements aligned with it have actually been allies of the United States. That sounds complicated. But now we're hearing that Turkey's been talking to the leader of the PKK, Abdullah Öcalan. And it seems that he's making a move toward laying down his arms. So what's happening here?
So since 2013, 2014, the Kurds have gained international recognition for their courageous fight against ISIS, ultimately ending with the territorial defeat of this inhumane organization that not only wreaked havoc in the region, but across European capitals and here in the US too. So once that recognition became global, Turkey, who, as I said, has half of the Kurdish population, was very threatened by this recognition of the Kurdish nation. And especially over the last 11 or 12 years, the Kurds have institutionalized, they've actually governed in the wake of defeating ISIS. And by all accounts, especially for the region they're in, they've governed very effectively. Values like gender equality, of respecting other faiths and minorities have really been celebrated by the international community. Now, as I said, this threatened Turkey very much. Once the Kurds established themselves and institutionalized themselves in Syria specifically, The Turkish government saw this as a threat because Kurds were gaining their rights and governing themselves in neighboring Syria with less than 3 million Kurds living there, with the 20 million Kurds in Turkey unable to do so. Even after democratic elections, electing their own mayors, the Turkish government would imprison them and appoint trustees. So the Kurds were unable to even take part in Turkish democracy. And in neighboring Syria, the Kurds are building governing institutions. So this was seen as a really big threat, with the Kurdish relationship expanding with the US and other regional countries and actors. Turkey saw this window now that they have to actually engage with the Kurds, in their own words, to prevent further Kurdish gains, actually. So this is born out of necessity more than sincerity for the Turkish government.
Possibly a good sign here, right? I mean, the Turks sort of relenting a little bit, maybe perhaps recognizing the strength of the movement, and maybe even watching some of these factions lay down their arms. But I mean, I guess let me broaden out for a second. I mean, when we look around the region right now, we see a massive amount of change. The map has shifted significantly since 10/7, especially in places where the Kurds have a presence. Are the Kurds still okay maintaining semi-autonomy as they have in the past? Or do you think this is a moment where people are using the I word? Are they thinking about independence?
So I would say for the Kurds right now, the matter is still existential. As we saw developments over last night and even in the last 10 years, ISIS was hell-bent on eradicating Kurds. The Turkish state for almost 100 years has not even accepted the existence of a distinct Kurdish nation. Now, when you're dealing with existential issues like that, thinking of independence might be a little bit of a stretch right now. But the Kurds have come to a place, as of today, whereby they're able to demand, for first, the recognition of their existence, but secondly, some degree of autonomy and empowerment to run their own affairs, to be able to even teach their own languages at schools, to name their children Kurdish names, which, as of today, is still a difficult thing to do in Turkey. So when you have existential issues like this that you're confronting, maybe the word independence is a bit of a stretch for now. But the Kurdish movement has sought democratization for the existing nation states that they live in right now. Now, what does that mean, and what can that promise for the future? You need to democratize the existing nation states to make a lot of these demands, and maybe ultimately one day the demand for independence. Why is Scotland able to have an independence referendum? Because the United Kingdom is a democratic country. So, some criticism has been leveled at the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan for supposedly, according to some, renouncing some of these demands like autonomy. But that I don't agree with that, and I think the demand for democracy is actually a level higher than demanding some of these autonomous institutions, because for any of that to happen in the first place, the existing nation states need to have some degree of democracy to even entertain the political debate. Because up until now, we've seen that there is no military solution or a military way out of this conundrum.
Yeah, and obviously looking at all the countries where Kurds currently have significant populations, we're looking at a pretty significant democracy deficit. I always think about Turkey. I remember learning about the Kurds in Turkey, decades ago, and learning that the Turks called their Kurds Mountain Turks. They wouldn't even call them Kurds. They wouldn't even recognize their identity, which is truly shocking. And I do think that at some point, something needs to give. Before I let you go, tell us a little bit about the Kurdish relationship with Israel. We've heard a lot about how Israel has armed, funded, and trained the Peshmerga, the fighters fielded by the Kurds. Is that still the case today? How would you describe the relationship between some of these Kurdish communities and the Jewish state?
So the relationship that you just described with the Peshmerga is with the Iraqi Kurds, and that's largely been under the radar. I think the Iraqi Kurds have been reluctant to acknowledge that relationship publicly because of putting a huge target, in their words, it puts a huge target on their back, and Iran is right there and is still shelling the Kurdistan region of Iraq whenever it feels the need to do so. So that's been largely non-public relations. But what's been going on recently in Syria is the relationship is becoming more public. We even had reports of a phone call between Ilham Ahmed and Gideon Saar, Ilham Ahmed being the de facto foreign minister of the Syrian Kurdish establishment that we have there. So suddenly this relationship has become a little more political and a little more public. And why wouldn't it at this point? These two peoples have a natural affinity, being minorities in a very volatile region. And I believe, looking forward, there's every potential for this relationship to deepen politically and publicly. And even the General Mazloum, the commander of the SDF, in a recent question asked of him by the BBC if he would accept, or if he acknowledges this relationship, he said yes, that they would accept a relationship and support from anyone given the current conditions on the ground. So I believe this is something to keep an eye on. This relationship has the hallmark of being a very, I would say, strategic relationship looking forward.
I tend to agree. And I tend to think, by the way, that the stronger Israel gets, the stronger America's reach is in the Middle East, the weaker that the Iranian axis becomes. I think the better off everyone's going to be in the region. We'll leave it there. Thank you, Giran Ozcan, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you for having me, John.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. FDD's Sinan Jidi and Sophia Epley wrote a piece in 1945 highlighting Turkey's ongoing efforts to position itself as the mediator in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. That sounds as bad as Putin positioning himself as a mediator in the U.S.-Iran nuclear standoff. Kind of like Qatar mediating the hostage talks. Seriously, folks, what the hell's going on? Okay, in a piece for the Wall Street Journal, my colleague Ruel Marc-Garec challenges Undersecretary of Defense for Policy nominee Elbridge Colby's suggestion that a better armed Israeli military would allow the U.S. to take a step back from the Middle East. Ruel argues that while Israel's military is formidable, it alone cannot take care of Iran, no matter how many U.S. weapons Israel has at its disposal. Simply put, there's no substitute for American military mojo. Finally, my colleague Hussein Abdul Hussein's latest piece in the Lebanese English language outlet, This is Beirut, discusses the prospects of peace between Lebanon and Israel. Hussein has been writing about this a lot lately, but he's tempered, I think. He argues that while peace is a worthy goal, Lebanon must first relearn democracy and all the values that come with it, including free speech and freedom of dissent. Who's going to hold their breath for that one to happen? Not me. And that's all for now, folks. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels. And please join the special community of those who support our mission with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. We are truly grateful for all of our donors to make this work possible. We literally cannot do it without you. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief featuring award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer Yardena Schwartz. We'll discuss her book, Ghosts of a Holy War, and more. So tune in for that one. Until then, have a restful weekend. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.